So this is the first of two lectures on, this is really the only lecture on the Zapatistas. It's the first of two lectures that is related to the Zapatistas because the next one and the next reading is, the next reading is done by Subcomandante Marcos, who is the best known of the Zapatista leaders. But his text is oriented towards sort of a diagnosis of the world picture in terms of what I would say for this class, control and revolt. So today we're going to talk about the Zapatista uprising and the nature of Zapatista communities. I guess I should speak generally first. This is the last week of the course, or the last bit of material, and we're moving clearly up towards the present. So we're going to look at a history beginning sort of in 1968 today. It's such a big year. But really the Zapatistas, they become publicly known and they sort of declare themselves as a revolutionary organization in 1994. So that's where we're starting. And then the history that I'll tell you a little bit about, I think Jorge Mancillas' text that I gave you to read ends around 2000, 2001. I'll go a little bit further than that, bringing us up to, well, in certain ways, the very present. And that is the purpose of this last batch of readings. We have Mancillas, and then we have Marcos, and then we have Grace Lee Boggs, and then we have this text on the revolution in Rojava. And so that means that with Mancillas we're starting sort of in 1994. With Marcos, that's a text written in 1999. The Grace Lee Boggs introduction to Revolution and Evolution is 2008, and the concluding text is 2016. So we're trying to come up to the present, and we're trying to see the way in which this revolutionary tradition, this revolutionary history that we've been looking at, continues itself into our present. I mean, for me, this is one of the most important things I want to say in a class called The Age of Revolt. As I said at the very beginning of the class, I assume when this class was made by I don't know whom, they planned it to be like an art history style class looking at the Romantic movement, mid-1700s to mid-late 1800s. I assume that's what they meant. That is not at all, of course, what we've done here at all. We've looked at a history of revolutions and theoretical and other types of documents that have come out of those revolutions, sometimes films or whatever. And I want to argue, you could talk about there being a revolutionary period at the end of the 18th century, at the end of the 1700s, and that's true. So there's the American Revolution, there's the French Revolution, there's the Haitian Revolution. You could also talk about the 1800s as being profoundly revolutionary, because we skipped this in our class. But there's a whole wave of revolutions that takes place in South America, many involving Simón Bolívar. And in Europe, of course, there are thousands and thousands of revolts, and there's, in France, there's 1830, 1848, 1871, all these different revolutions. So that's clearly a revolutionary period. But then the 20th century sees some of the grandest revolutions in human history. So, of course, 1905 and 1917 in Russia, 1918 in Germany, and then there's the Chinese Revolution, and we looked at the Algerian Revolution, we've mentioned the Vietnamese Revolution, there are all the anti-colonial movements in Africa. We sort of skipped over Arab nationalism because we only have so much room, but that's a big movement in the 1950s and the 1960s, which we'll touch on a little bit in the last piece of reading, because it's the establishment of the Ba'ath regime comes from Arab nationalism in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and that's a state socialist style regime which sort of hardens into top-down authoritarian control, but which was meant to stand off global capitalism and formed part of a bloc with the Soviet Union. So that takes us up through the 1960s, and then of course there's the Cuban Revolution, and that brings us to where we are and we're going to continue this all the way through to our present, right? So, I mean, this civil rights period, Black Power movement in the United States, the American Indian movement. The point I want to make is that it's not that the period of revolutions ends. It's not that there's a revolutionary period. There's this famous conservative theorist by the name of Francis Fukuyama, who, actually referring to Hegel, Hegel had the idea, remember I talked about this, that history was moving towards a final place, and that final place would be the realization of human self-consciousness on a social scale. A lot of neocons and neoliberals and this theorist Francis Fukuyama basically think that we have reached the end of history, that what we've got now with global capitalism, this massive globalized economic system, these sort of mass-based representational alleged democracies, which are really closer to corporatocracies, that this is where human history plateaus, that this is it, we made it. Now we get to, like, you know, buy shit on Amazon and it's going to be brought to us by drone. That's the end of things. But I certainly feel exactly otherwise. There is still an increase of wealth disparity. There's still an increase of radical exploitation and violence towards the vast majority of the Earth's population, etc., etc. And the revolutionary traditions which such conditions of control inevitably spawn continue as well. That's the thing I want you to think about. And I want you to recognize, you know, so I'm telling a long story in this class, and the long story involves the development of a particular form of revolutionary thought, which is what we're really starting to see when we look at the Zapatistas and when we look at Rojava, and also when we look at these smaller, more local projects, for example, Detroit Summer, or the other projects that Grace Lee Boggs will describe in Detroit. All of these new revolutionary forms have similarities with one another. They are far more anarchist than they are Marxist, although they still rely in certain ways on Marxist critique of capitalism. They no longer endorse a Marxist-Leninist model of revolution. They have jettisoned top-down control structures. They're trying to get rid of patriarchy and misogyny. They're trying to make their movements pluralistic rather than homogenous, so as to include a whole bunch of different interest groups under one banner who can work together. And I think autonomous self-government and something like the council system is really the dominant model at present, and it's the one that I support, that I think I'm very hopeful about. I mean, I don't know how hopeful I am that state structures and corporate power will allow democratic self-government to exist. I have a lot of fear. I mean, the Zapatistas have been around for, since they started organizing for like probably 40 years, which is pretty impressive. The people in Rojava have been organizing, depending on how you count it, for at least 20 years. It's quite possible, I think, that Rojava will be destroyed by the Turks with the implicit acceptance of the U.S. But then, of course, these things hinge on the outcome of the Syrian civil war and like the broader politics and geopolitical military layout of the Middle East. So these things are not known. But I want you to understand that revolutionary thought, revolutionary insistence, and radical demands for radical democratic control of territory, radical demands for like large-scale alterations to the pattern of life, these still exist, and they're still being nurtured, and people are developing them, and situations where these ideas become more than ideas really do exist. I find this profoundly uplifting, and I just want to share it with you. So that's the point of this of the end of the course, is to bring all this stuff into contact with the present, and we do that in these three locations: in Chiapas, in southern Mexico, in Detroit, primarily with Grace Lee Boggs, and then in Rojava, which again is on the border between Turkey and Syria. This is what we're looking at the end of the course. Now, the text that I want to talk about today is by a guy named Jorge Mancillas, and aside from what he tells us in his own piece of writing, I don't really know much about him. No, I don't know anything about him, so I'm not going to give you a biography about him. If you want to learn a little about him, you can read it in his text yourself. He was involved in an autonomous community on the outskirts of Tijuana in 1974, which was violently broken up by the PRI, by the Mexican state. And he says that he was lucky to be one of a few people who was convinced to go into something closer to electoral politics instead of becoming a guerrilla fighter. Most of the people who became guerrilla fighters during that period were killed. Probably they were tortured at length beforehand, and they were probably tortured at length by government forces. And it may well be that those government forces had some advisement or some participation from the U.S. and from the CIA. You know, that we, and I don't buy this "we," of course. Like, I think the CIA is some other people and not me. And when I find out that friends, I met one guy successful person, who I met because he's a dad of another kid at my kid's school, who develops software, 3D modeling software, and one of his primary clients is the CIA. This nice guy. When I heard that, I became depressed, and I haven't stopped being depressed since about that, because I like him otherwise. But I think he's lent himself to an evil. And I've been asking the question, who is we? I think so long as we sit silently and allow things to go their own way, maybe we are the CIA and the Defense Department and the drone program, because we facilitate it. This is what the Boggses say. We facilitate it with our silence. But if we become somewhat active and start trying to organize realities which are radically distinct from, the practices of the nation state in the service of multinational capital, I don't think we have to say we anymore. So the CIA was probably operating in Mexico, as it still is, and I'm not there. Okay, so anyway, what is the story that Mancillas tells us? First, I want to point out, this is the first time that I used this text in class, and it's different from a lot of texts about the Zapatistas because it's written from the perspective of a leftist with revolutionary history, and it sounds from the tone of his voice still revolutionary objectives, but it is nevertheless critical of the Zapatistas. So I'll start there. I want to tell you the basic criticism that he gives of the Zapatista movement, which is really a criticism and a sort of lament about the left on the whole, and I think we can talk about that a little broadly. And then I want to talk about the history that he lays out, and that's the reason that I included this text, because I think that history for understanding the origin of the Zapatista movement is interesting and sort of important, and it fills out some of the history we've been looking at in this class, and it helps to understand what that movement is and how revolutionary movements in the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st have changed their character. Then I want to add some stuff about what I know about the Zapatistas, how they govern themselves, what they've done historically since the period that Mancillas covers. And on the basis of that, I want to argue back against his critical judgment about the Zapatistas. And I don't know how far that'll go, but you can judge for yourself. So, first, what is his criticism? So the Zapatistas show up in 1994. And I'll go back over the history in a moment. They show up. I mean, they had been organizing for 10 or 15 years, sort of depending on how you count. They had been organizing as autonomous communities even before the arrival of leftists coming out of Mexico City and out of the 1968 student movement. Even before Marcos and his cadre showed up, communities in Chiapas, in the highlands of Chiapas, had been organizing themselves and working together with particular guy, Bishop Samuel Ruiz, who had attended the Medellin conference in 1968, at which a bunch of radical Catholics, priests and nuns and bishops got together and had a whole retreat. They talked about scripture, but they made a radical decision to read the gospel in a radical sense and to understand it as a mandate to advocate for the poor on a worldly basis, to improve the conditions of the lowest classes. And so he went back to Chiapas and was involved with people in the highlands, organizing communities. So that was going on forever. But in 1994, not forever, for decades. 1994, January 1st, 1994 is the day that NAFTA went into effect. And one of the things that NAFTA did, and in general, what NAFTA has done, what the TPP was supposed to do, but also what the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund do on a regular basis, is they trump national constitutions. And that's not supposed to be a pun. They override local self-government, and not just local self-government like we've been talking about it in this class, where communities, villages govern themselves, but even national self-government gets overridden by the general concerns of international capital. And that's what happened with NAFTA in Mexico, and in particular one article of the Mexican Constitution, which had been put in place in large part as the result of the efforts of the original Zapata, Emiliano Zapata, who fought in the Mexican Revolution of 1910, which people often also refer to as the Mexican Civil War. Zapata had operated in this part of Mexico, and he had been the most radically indigenous focused, peasant focused leader. He himself was a peasant. And as they took over territory, Zapata and his army reassigned land to the people who had worked on it. And specifically, they sought to defend territory for indigenous people. Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, which came out of that conflict, provided for a certain amount of land for indigenous people. Traditional community lands were to be protected. NAFTA did away with that protection. And as I understand it, basically the land that the poorest people in Chiapas had in 1994 was very little, and it was the worst land, ravine land in large part, stuff that big ranchers couldn't really make any use of, so they let the indigenous folks have it. That was going to be revoked, and it was going to be revoked for a few reasons. Well, no, rather, it was revoked. And it was revoked so that the territory could be open for tourism. I mean, this is a big boom industry internationally. Some people think that tourism is a better usage of land because it tends, it doesn't involve mountaintop removal, for example. That might be true. But it does take part in the general wave of capitalism, which tends to unearth and erode indigenous pre-existent cultures. But they also wanted to extract resources. There's a lot of gold, there's a lot of uranium in Chiapas, and that's what they were after. So the Zapatista rebellion happens in response to that. And in this first move, and then in the following year, the Zapatistas take over the land of thousands of ranchers where previously they themselves and people like them, poor indigenous people, and a lot of immigrants from the rest of Central America, pushed northward by U.S.-backed right-wing conflicts, where there would be, say, take like, Honduras or El Salvador or Nicaragua, places where there were democratically elected socialist regimes, and then the United States sent the CIA and special forces people to train up, well, for example, the Contras, to train right-wing militias and paramilitary groups and vigilante groups to carry out campaigns of terror. I mean, really horrible stuff, just like conquest kind of stuff. Peeling children's faces off. I shit you not. This is the kind of stuff that happened in Nicaragua. So all these conflicts produced waves of migrants. And you need to understand this stuff. When we talk about migration and all that, it's not really true that people just come to the U.S. because they want a better life. That is one of the stories that we're told. People come to the U.S. because they're pushed from elsewhere, because it sucks so bad elsewhere. And the sucking so bad elsewhere has everything to do with the general effects of global capitalism. So, for example, my family, my extended family, my wife's family, moved from Bulgaria to the United States in 1989, sort of by accident. They were on their way to Canada and got stopped. They didn't do it because they were like in love with the United States. They did it because they were afraid of what was happening in their country as communism fell apart. And why did communism fall apart? Well, because of the global pressure of capitalism, right? So I think it's very important to recognize, look at the refugee crisis in Europe. It's very important to recognize that waves of migration are related to global economy and to geopolitical and global military situations. There's constant warfare going on in order to open up resources, labor, supplies, and markets for capital. And this is being carried out in large part by American Special Forces intelligence, and then the network of allies, of course, the Mossad and the French and the English and so on. The old colonial forces are still at it. So when you think about migration and people coming to the United States, especially from Mexico, you should realize that there are pressures in place which objective pressures, which objectively force waves of people in certain directions. And it's not their fault. And it is a system that we are already a part of. This is an argument for, our obligation to accept immigrants. Anyway, I'm talking a lot. I wonder what that text was. Let's see. That was a friend of mine just sent me a text to thank me for putting up with this asshole who showed up at his New Year's Eve party where I was. Okay, so the Zapatistas show up in 1994. Mancillas' point, and this corresponds in a way to the Boggs reading that you've recently done. His point is that when they make their appearance, they declare themselves to be a broad revolutionary organization. They declare war on the Mexican military. They call for the ouster of the Mexican president. But by 1995, 1996, it looks to Mancillas like their demands are starting to shrink. And basically he's like, look, this is what has happened to the left. And he's sad about this. He's like, in the late 1960s, the left was truly revolutionary. It was involved in broad organizing, and it was able to muster forces that at least had to be taken seriously by governments, and sometimes, as we'll see in this history, too seriously, violently. But what has happened, he thinks, and he goes all the way through what sounds like a really conservative portrayal of the anti-globalization movement, people wearing turtle costumes and stuff. And he's like, Jesus Christ, we used to be serious revolutionaries. Now we're a bunch of people wearing turtle costumes, talking about turtles and gay people waving rainbow flags. And he seems not to have much respect for this, which is sort of understandable, but it's understandable primarily if you have locked yourself into a model of understanding of what revolutionary is, where revolutionary means military, paramilitary, organization in order to be able to face off with the state and perhaps one day to depose it. Generally speaking, that's That's not what revolution is anymore. That's not the kind of revolution that is possible. But this is not to say that real revolution is not possible. So his point is simply, when they emerge, they declare themselves a full revolutionary movement that wants to alter the entirety of Mexico. But within 5-6 short years, by 2000, 2001, they have reduced themselves down, he thinks, reduced themselves down to a sort of single cause interest group. This is similar to the critique that the Boggses made about what came out of the Black Power movement and the what became of revolutionary action in the United States in the early 1970s, that everything devolves into an interest group. If the Zapatistas devolve into an interest group, the interest group they become is an organization for the protection of the rights of indigenous people in Mexico. And they are composed in large part of Mayan people. Oh, and what I was talking about earlier with the waves of migration, my point is that it's not just, Mayans who are indigenous to the region of Chiapas. It's also a whole bunch of people from the rest of Central America being pushed north. Now, many of those people continue onward and migrate all the way to the United States, but a lot of them get deposited, and some of the poorest of them get deposited just once they get into Mexico. That's the makeup of Chiapas. Okay, so this is his criticism, that like the Zapatistas look cool, but they basically become a kind of trivial organization, affiliated, he's right, with the anti-globalization movement. So a whole lot of the organizers in 1998, 1999 through 2001 or 2, who organized large actions against the World Trade Organization and neoliberalism in general. A whole lot of those people were in contact with the Zapatistas and modeled a lot of things on the basis of the Zapatistas. So there is that coalition. But Mancillas is not, he's not impressed by it. He's like, damn it, it's just all fallen apart, right? Okay, so let's tell the story, let's track over the history that he gives us, and then we can come back, and then I'll add to that history, and then we can come back and ask, well, is everything really as bad as he says, or is there not something really interesting, valid, and resilient in the Zapatista movement, which is what I think. And to me, the thing that is totally real and not weak or just a single special interest in the case of the Zapatistas is similar to the logic. It's related to the logic that grounded the UC occupations in, what is that, like 2008, the Occupy movement, 2000, what is that, 11, 10, no, 11, 12. That is, what's important to me about the Zapatistas is that they're holding territory. They have actually established an autonomous region, a network of self-governed territories, and a network of societies within those territories, and something in its own way sort of resembling the council system that we've been talking about, or the network of communes that we've been talking about. And while it may not be actively agitating for full revolution against the Mexican government, in fact, there are places where Marcos will say that the Zapatistas are pro-Mexican government, just anti-Mexican military. The point there being that, look, we need every possible foothold we can have to push against global capital. And at this point in history, and this is really part of the next lecture, at this point in history, it looks like global multinational corporations have seized the reins of global control, and national governments are nothing but what Marcos will call they're little dwarves. And so if we could strengthen national governments against multinational capital, maybe that would be good. Of course, this can be done in various ways. So, like, I mean, you might be thinking already in this lecture, and I guess you could think about it some more in the next, that Trump, came into office, among other things, on the basis of an opposition to NAFTA, which means that this kind of isolationist, nationalist, proto-fascist movement that Trump spearheads has things in common with the left, has things in common with anarchists. And that's true. Trump saw that there were problems with NAFTA, but I think more he saw that portions of the United States knew that there were problems with NAFTA. So I remember when NAFTA went into effect, my dad was super involved in organizing farmers through his church. And he was opposed to it because it was really clear that a whole lot of grain production would suffer. Anyway, Trump saw this stuff, right? The Trump situation is a complicated one. Anyway, okay, so back to the history that Mancillas gives us. He's like, okay, revolution in Mexico has not fared well. Of course, there's a certain stereotype maybe, or like a long and not so deep tradition in Mexico related to revolution, such that the party that dominated for the large majority of Mexico's history, the PRI, still has revolutionary in its title, right? So Mancillas starts there. He's like, okay, so the Mexican Revolution ends. There's a period, he doesn't really talk about this, but there's a period in the 1920s where Mexico is basically a socialist regime under Obregón. And then that stuff starts to get backed off. You know, the problem before, Diaz, who was in office for like 30 years, had basically sold Mexico to foreign interests. And that was one of the key factors leading to that revolution, besides the fact that peasants were basically enserfed. They were murdered at will. The conditions of their life were really horrible. Anyway, the socialist regime just starts to get backed off. And the relationship with international capital again grows. And what Mancillas tells us is like the PRI was able to endure a whole bunch of really revolutionary leftist movements through its history. In the 1930s, it was able to withstand large-scale union organizing led by the Communist Party. In the 1960s, and here we're getting into the real history we want to talk about, it endured a whole bunch of urban, he calls them, I think Mancillas calls them urban mobilizations, especially a student movement, an independent union movement compared to like large-scale business unions. We're talking about local shop-based unions. And peasant movement in the 1960s, and this becomes like a really large student movement, and it's affiliated, it's in contact with the American student movement, especially SDS, which was Students for a Democratic Society. So this probably passed you by if you don't know his name in the reading, but he says the first person, when he heard about the Zapatistas, the first person that he called was Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden was a California representative. I think he died a year or two ago. But he had previously been probably the best known, one of two or three of the best known leaders of Students for a Democratic Society. So he has this long radical history. And if Mancillas was a part of the 60s generation of student radicals, that's probably how he came to know Tom Hayden. So there was collaboration between the student movement in the US and in Mexico. But then what happens? What happens in 1968 happens sort of across the whole world. Like, I mean, 1968 is really horrible. And when I was at this New Year's Eve party, which I left at like 10:30 to take my kid home, I was talking with the particular guy who was really problematic. I was talking to him. This is before he started saying a whole bunch of nasty things about women. He was saying, like, everybody says 2017 is the worst year ever, but there's got to be worse ones, right? And we're thinking about it like, well, yeah, 1968 was a worse year. The 1930s, you know, brilliant time for labor power, but of course we have the Depression and the Dust Bowl, the World Wars. Okay, so, you know, our past year is not the worst one ever. 1968 definitely tops it. Horrible shit happens in 1968. In Mexico City, the Olympics were scheduled to come. And student organizing had taken place around a whole bunch of different things, especially an election that was probably messed with by the PRI. But also there's this like larger wave of organizing going on internationally. The student movement's getting really strong, and it starts to look like it's going to be an obstacle to the bringing of the Olympics, which of course brings all kinds of money into Mexico, and probably in really complicated ways too. Like it probably facilitates the entrance of a whole bunch of capital under the auspice of loans. But at any rate, in Mexico, as in Prague, as in many other places in the world, the state forces, the government just decides it's not going to be gentle anymore. And so at a place called Tlatelolco Square, on I think October 2nd, 1968, a large nonviolent student protest. And I mean, this is a movement that has like massive support, right? You know, students, unions, peasants, general support is violently suppressed by military detachments trained specifically for this purpose. I forget what the name is. They have a specific name. Couple hundred people are shot right there in the square. They just open fire on the protesters, and then they round up a whole bunch of people. They arrest people, and they torture them. And this is sort of the point where what will become the Zapatistas begins. But it begins as a defeat. And this is what Mancillas thinks he's telling the story of. He's like, the left has never recovered from 1968. That's probably true in a lot of ways globally. And that's one of the reasons that mainstream liberal and even more neocon and neoliberal people can suggest that the period of revolution is over. But that requires that there's certain things they just don't look at. So what this produces is a wave of radicals who are being pursued by government forces, by military forces, by military intelligence in collaboration with police. And when they catch people who are leaders of this movement, they kidnap them and they torture them, and maybe they disappear them. So there's, what Mancillas says is like through the 1970s, there's basically a dirty war that takes place in Mexico. So what happened was, and Mancillas says this is sort of where he fit in. He's from that generation of student protesters, student activists, and he was involved in an autonomous community, and that's important. Autonomous, I would think that I've mentioned this, but maybe not. Yeah, I have. Nomos means like law giving. Auto means to yourself. So to be autonomous means to determine your own rules, to not receive direction from outside. So he was a member in 1974, leading up to 1974, of a very large autonomous community outside of Tijuana called Colonia Tierra Libertad, which is interesting because that's going on at the same time as the Back to the Land movement. Well, I guess towards the tail end of the Back to the Land movement in the United States, and especially in California, where there is a free land movement. Anyway, so he's a part of this enterprise, and it's broken up violently by the military, and the leaders are captured and tortured. So the remaining sort of militant left goes into hiding. It runs to the countryside, and those who are most devoted among it form guerrilla cells. So, there's something interesting here that is worth looking at. When the movement was in the cities, student union movement, it wasn't necessarily armed, and its agenda was not a military agenda. That's not what it was trying to do. It was trying to achieve things through protest and pressure and strikes. Then the state decides it's had enough. It won't deal with this opposition, and so it crushes it. But the crushing of the student and union movement produces this spray, and the spray then becomes seeds for full-on armed guerrilla movements, which historically probably bleed in different ways into the cartels, among other things. My point there is simply that there is a continual sort of feedback relationship between state repression and revolutionary action. One produces the other, and the other produces the one. They're linked phenomena. They're sort of a part of one another in a weird way. Anyway, so through the 1970s, the Mexican authorities are chasing down these remaining militants and dealing with these guerrilla groups. Most of them never get very large. A few of them actually are involved in firefights with state forces, and then they're destroyed. And Mancillas says, and so Mancillas thinks he's telling a story about the destruction of the left in Mexico. In the 1980s, most of the remaining leftists from that previous generation, and Marcos is from this generation, some of the people who helped to organize the Zapatista movement are from this generation and are from this wave of guerrilla groups. There's one in particular called the FLN. Different one than, or is it the FNL? No, FLN. Same name, different words. This particular group becomes the seed group for the Zapatistas, or one of the seed groups for the Zapatistas. Mostly in the 1980s, the remaining leftists find their way into electoral politics. And you can see that Mancillas thinks this is like a defeat, and it really is a defeat. You might not think so on the face of it, because to be included in mainstream politics seems like a victory, right? Like now you're a part of decision making. But in order to make that shift, these radical groups have to become way less radical. And basically to take part in mainstream politics means to reaffirm the basic system that you're a part of, while like then agitating for like small changes in certain ways. And so this is a disappointment to Mancillas. And so he says they're totally surprised. He and like the other members of this generation who he knows are totally surprised when out of nowhere the Zapatistas appear. So what had happened was that a small detachment of this one particular guerrilla group had found its way into Chiapas, and after a few months, only 3 or 4 of them are left. But they end up melding with the already underway organization, self-organization of prominently Mayan people in Chiapas. That's a self-organization which had some connection to radical Catholicism, to liberation theology, but which also was undertaken by themselves. And then what the Marcos generation sort of infused was a Marxist analysis, specifically like an Althusserian analysis. Althusser is a sort of important neo-Marxist theorist in the 1960s and 70s. That's who Marcos studied primarily in school. That's one of the people that I've been interested in studying too. And they slowly grew themselves into this movement. Okay, so let's move then from 1994 forward. In 1994, on the day that NAFTA goes into effect, as a sort of symbolic thing, but not only symbolic, this is one of the things about the Zapatistas. They're always playing this sort of clever, puzzling game where they bounce it back and forth between being full-on armed revolutionaries, which they never stop being. I mean, they're armed. They have self-defense committees for their communities. They're armed people. But they bounce back and forth between emphasizing that and pursuing a military revolutionary course, which they sort of have to do in order to maintain their territory. So they're constantly skirmishing with the Mexican military. And as I hear it because I've met a couple of Zapatistas, also skirmishing with special forces from all over the world, especially the United States, but from all over the world. the person who was talking to me talked specifically about China, because detachments of people will drop into Chiapas in order to extract uranium and probably in order to extract gold, and you'll have these little like secured territories against the Zapatistas where one and another, globally capital authorized teams will show up in order to extract things, and so there's firefights going on. It's a guerrilla situation. But then at the same time, it looks like there's this whole like media communications symbolic dimension to what the Zapatistas are doing. They've been very clever at bouncing back and forth between these, and this is, their general publicity, their ability to spread propaganda, make themselves look cool, get kids in Los Angeles to wear their t-shirts. This whole information and almost marketing dimension of their movement is sort of unprecedented, and without it, arguably, they would no longer exist. So the fact that they show up January 1st, 1994 has a symbolic dimension too, which is about NAFTA. So they take over the town of San Cristobal, which I think the full name of that is San Cristobal de las Casas. In that town there is a cathedral named after de las Casas. They take over the town, they hold it for a couple of days. They are subjected to massive retaliation by the Mexican military, which bombs them and strafes them from helicopters and kills hundreds of them. But then there's a large protest in Mexico City, which Mancillas mentions. Over 100,000 people show up to protest the government crackdown on this indigenous uprising. And the thing that he leaves out is that at the same time, a recently constructed international network of internet-based communications collectives, a lot of it coming out of AIDS activism, AIDS and art activism in the U.S. especially, in New York especially. They get a hold of the Zapatista story and they publicize it. So there's this spreading of awareness about the existence of the Zapatistas, and the way that Comandante Ramona, who's probably the other best known Zapatista person, she's dead now, the way that she put it was that it was as if the internet awareness, the international awareness produced through the internet, constructed a sort of force field around Chiapas, without which, she said, they would certainly have been eradicated. So the government is forced to back off by pressure, by protest pressure, by media pressure. And then by 1995, literally, the territory is encircled, and the Mexican government begins a large project of road building, which is nominally to give access to the area, but they didn't build roads before. They did it they do it to encircle the area, and then they do it increasingly so that they can extract the resources that they want from the area, even with the Zapatistas there. And so Mancillas sort of leaves it there. That by 1995 they're totally encircled, and then he just goes on and he's like, I forget what his years are. By 2000, 2001, it looks like they've been reduced to this where they started off as a full-on revolutionary movement. It looks like they've been reduced to this single, like an interest group for the indigenous. And so what I want to say is, well, that's not entirely correct. He leaves out some stuff. For one thing, let's see, 1997, there's a massacre carried out by paramilitary groups, by a vigilante group called Peace and Justice. And they massacre people. There are two towns called Acteal, and one of them was a Zapatista supporting town, and the other one was a sort of religious community. This vigilante group goes into the religious community, where people spend a lot of time out of every day praying, and it shoots people all day long, mostly women and children, mostly in the back, mostly while they're praying. Let's see. I guess my point is that the whole region endures a whole series of attacks by state forces under different guises. This is an important thing to recognize. If you want to recognize how state power works, it doesn't just work in the figure of the National Guardsman or the official police officer. It also facilitates the arming and training of vigilante groups. And what happened to Acteal was that the Mexican military encircled the town, didn't let anybody in or out except for these vigilantes, and refused to do anything while the vigilantes, while Peace and Justice, shot down one after another child in this town. This is also how state force operates. And in this respect, I think, or if you thought about the Contras in Nicaragua and El Salvador, you got to recognize that state power uses terror. It wants to produce an ambience of terror. The only difference, I think, between non-state actor terrorism and state terrorism is that state terrorism wants to produce a local halo, a local effect of terror to prevent people from associating with one or another, typically leftist regime. Although, of course, state socialist regimes can do the exact same thing and do the exact same thing. In this part of the world, we're talking about right-wing groups. Now I blanked out on what I was going to say. State terrorism versus non-state terrorism. State terrorism wants to keep its effect local, and it wants to keep what it's doing out of the media. Non-state actor terrorism, like the kind of thing that we saw starting in Algeria, the kind of thing that we see on a kind of regular basis now as ISIS or ISIS-inspired people drive trucks into big crowds of people, for example. That variety of terrorism, which is non-state actors, the primary difference is that it wants media publicity. Without media publicity, its effects are radically reduced. And this is why one of the central tenets of counter-terrorism is to deny media access. But my main point is that state power rests on terror. And if you want to really evaluate what's up with this, they've set up an autonomous government based on local councils, and so there'll be a building in each one of these communities, which is the center of their government, and everybody in the community takes part in discussions to determine what needs to happen in their community, and then they send delegates to regional assemblies, which share the opinions and problems of these localities and try to work them through, and then come back to their bases and say, this is what we learned over there, what do you want to do? So this is a system of radical democracy, grassroots democracy, interestingly intertwined with very long-lived Mayan cultural traditions, which has taken over territory and sustained itself for 35 years. It's because it's there that it's able to be involved in all of these different things. It has stood off the Mexican government and American special forces for 35 years. And I think that, just the holding of space, and then within space, within the held space, the working out of new relationships, new types of relationship. They're attempting to reverse patriarchal traditions. They're attempting to reverse the effects of state-centric education. They're working out their own education. They have formed a free community, a free and democratic community where freedom and democracy mean much more than they mean in our part of the world. And there's a reason that they are referenced and that they are studied and that they are visited by other resistance movements like the anti-globalization movement and Occupy and so on. And that is that they, just insofar as they have established an autonomously governed territory, they have a foothold for possible further expansion. And I would say, the success or failure of the Zapatistas does not rest on whether they end up extending themselves, whether they end up changing Mexican society on the whole. The real question is, how long can they make it living in this free way?